Guys, today Clorinde the build guide. There is a lot to unpack here, so stay focused. Let's start. First of all, let's talk stats. Offensively speaking, Clorinde is a pretty straightforward unit that wants attack, damage bonus, and crit. Regarding attack specifically, theoretically speaking, she could have an alternative in Elemental Mastery for the sands and the substats. I'm talking about her in her Dendro teams here, so a context where she gets access to quicken reactions and even Hyper Bloom. When these are factored in, of course attack loses value, but for the quicken only scenario, it stays better than Elemental Mastery. This is because Clorinde's multipliers are quite high, and this only helps attack, so even with Quicken in the picture, Elemental Mastery can close the gap. On the other hand, in the Quick Bloom scenario, Elemental Mastery becomes very competitive. For the rest, in terms of main stats, still pretty standard, as a damage bonus goblet is always much better than an attack one. Meanwhile, her crit rate situation is pretty interesting, as she has a crit rate ascension stat and she also gets 20% crit rate from her second passive. This means that if you give her a crit rate circlet, even without a crit rate weapon, she will overcap on this stat after just 5 crit rate substats on average. As a result, in the vast majority of cases, she will want a crit damage circlet. Next up, regarding her energy, she has a 60 energy cost elemental burst that is quite instrumental to her rotations. It's not only very strong hit in terms of damage, but it will also give her a 120 bond of life. For all of those who don't know, her elemental skill consumes bond of life to deal as much damage as possible, so by using the burst you will deal a lot of front-loaded damage and will also set up the bond of life for the elemental skill right after. So basically you really want to use the burst every rotation, and the situation for her energy requirements is pretty much this. She'd almost never need energy recharge investment if she has Fischl on her team. Yaya is also pretty good, but not quite as good as Fischl. Meanwhile, the lower end electro particle generators like Sarah and Beidou make her energy requirements jump up to around 140. Lastly, the you don't want to play this character scenario. With no second electron team, her energy requirements will be around 190, so pretty bad. Just use Fischl, man. Now let's talk her artifact sets. There are a few different scenarios here. As a baseline, she has a best in slot here, which is the Whimsy set, so the Bond of Life set that came out for Arlecchino, but that of course also works for Clorinde. This is better than all the other options for the two main scenarios, which would be the Quicken scenario and the non-Quicken scenario. Still, she has pretty great alternatives, specifically the Gladiator set that buffs normal attack damage, and that's because all of her attacks during her special stance are considered normal attacks. Even the elemental skill that consumes Bond of Life that I mentioned before, it's considered a normal attack. So, just like it is for Arlecchino, the Gladiator set is a very competitive option here, even more so in a realistic sense, since I'm sure many of you have spectacular Gladiator pieces just lying around. The Echoes set is also pretty good, but compared to the Gladiator set, it's less consistent because its activation is reliant on the ping you have. I calculated it for a 60 ping scenario, but it could easily be worse for you. It's sure as hell worse for me, stupid Italian internet, man. If the Dreams is mostly bad, even on Quicken teams, but on Quick Bloom it becomes a tiny bit better. But the truly interesting talking point here is the Thundering Fury set. In terms of stats, the Thundering Fury set is of course much worse compared to the Whimsy set, but the true value here is in the cooldown reduction, obviously. In fact, Clorinde can use her elemental skill to enter a special stance for 9 seconds where she can spam normal attacks and their other skills to deal damage, and the base skill has a cooldown of 16 seconds. This means that normally she can only enter this stance once a rotation. But long story short, the Thundering Fury set can reduce her cooldown enough to allow her to use her elemental skill twice a rotation. This is only viable on teams where she can trigger electro reactions herself to actually activate the Thundering Fury set effect. Realistically, I can only see this happening on Quicken and Quick Bloom teams, and luckily for her, these are her best teams. For Quicken teams in particular, it's especially interesting because if you plan to use the elemental skill twice with Clorinde, you'll have to run 25 seconds long team rotations. This is a scenario that really favors Fischl, as she'll be able to use odds twice on this team instead of just once. I could do more explaining here, that's for sure, but the long story short is that on short rotations she can only use odds once, while on long rotations she can use him twice. This makes the long rotations versions of Clorinde quicken teams theoretically better than the short rotations ones, and as a result, the Thundering Fury set could actually be the best in slot option for Clorinde even above the Whimsy set. It also just gives her more quality of life as well, because normally Clorinde can swap out during her special stance duration or she'll lose it. Specifically on quicken teams this can be a problem, because you have characters like Nahida and Kazuha that really like to swap in midway through the rotation to reapply their things on new opponents, for example. And thanks to the Thundering Fury set, Clorinde gains a playstyle that is more quick swappy, close to Keqing's actually, which just fits the team much better. So I really wouldn't be surprised if the Thundering Fury set actually ends up being the best in slot option for her. Let me remind you that if you enjoy my content but you haven't subbed yet, please consider doing so because it really makes me notice your support. Now, for the weapons, she has a signature and surprise surprise, it's her best in slot. You could see this as an improved version of Missplitter, which already gives a pretty good idea of how strong this weapon is. It gives the same base attack, 20% more crit damage and 8% more damage bonus. Typical signature weapon power creep, nothing too weird to see here, but the flip side of this is that Missplitter is also pretty great on Clorinde. Truthfully, a lot of the 5-star sword options are very strong in general. In this case, among all, you have Heran and the already mentioned Missplitter being the best alternatives to her signature. I'll keep it a buck here though, between the two I prefer Missplitter because Heran gives crit rate with its secondary stat, and with Clorinde already having a lot of crit rate by default, that's not ideal for stat building. For the same reason, Jade Cutter is very tricky to handle here because it gives a whole 44% crit rate with its secondary stat, and that creates a situation where you literally can't have more than a single crit rate substat or you'll waste part of the weapon's passive, so that's pretty extreme. For the rest, we have Light of Foliar that on paper looks pretty good because of all the crit damage it gives, but realistically it's not that great because part of the passive benefits the character more if they build Elemental Mastery, but Clorinde doesn't want to do that even on Quicken teams. But on Quick Bloom teams at least it should be great. For the 4-star options there are some decent swords here, but for the most part it's way below what the signature can do. They all have flops of some kind. Black Sword is theoretically good, but it having a crit rate subset makes it tricky to build around, just like it is for Heran. Lion's Roar requires the enemy to have Electro applied on him to give the character a damage bonus, which is only consistent on mono Electro teams or aggravate teams with multiple Electro units. It probably won't work very well on Chevreuse teams where the Pyro application can take the Electro aura away. Finale of the Deep, the Fontaine craftable, basically only gives you attack, which isn't exactly ideal for Quicken. Like true, Clorinde still likes attack there, but compared to damage bonus, crit, it just kills worse for Quicken. But probably is that the surprising part is that it's mediocre for other cases as well. This is because Clorinde is a passive that gives her additional multipliers, but only for a certain limit of attack. The long story short here is that for many of her teams, Finale of the Deep makes her go over this limit. So it's just pretty bad, and that's all I have to say about the weapons. Yeah, and I'm done for today. If you like this video, make sure to subscribe and also go check the Arlecchino post-release video where I compared her to New Villette and Hu Tao. Bye bye.